The autumn wind swept across the Montana Territory with the kind of bitter cold that cut through a man's coat and settled deep in his bones. Samuel Hartwell pulled his worn leather jacket tighter as he guided his horse down the main street of Copper Creek, the small frontier town that served as his only connection to civilization. Before we begin, we'd like to ask you to tell us your name and the city you're watching from. We love getting to know our audience. Also, please don't forget to give this video a like, share it with others, and subscribe to our channel. That way, we can keep bringing you more stories like this one. The wooden buildings stood like weathered sentinels against the harsh landscape, their paint peeling and windows clouded with dust from countless prairie storms. Sam rarely made these trips to town only when supplies ran dangerously low or when the loneliness at his ranch became too heavy to bear. 3 years had passed since consumption took his wife Mary, and the silence of his homestead had become both his refuge and his prison. The ranch that once echoed with Mary's laughter and gentle humming now held only the sound of wind through broken shutters and his own footsteps on creaking floorboards. He tied his horse outside Morrison's general store, noting how the townspeople averted their eyes as he passed. Sam had earned a reputation as a man of few words, someone who conducted his business quickly and left without engaging in the social pleasantries that bound the small community together. They didn't understand that words had died with Mary, leaving him with a vocabulary suited only for transactions and necessities. As he emerged from the store with his provisions, commotion near the church caught his attention. Small crowd had gathered, their voices carrying a mixture of curiosity and barely concealed cruelty. Sam approached slowly, his boots crunching on the frost-covered ground. "She's been waiting there since dawn," whispered Mrs. Henderson to her companion. "Poor thing probably doesn't even understand what's happening." In the center of the gathering sat a young woman on a wooden crate, her hands folded in her lap with a dignity that seemed untouchable, despite the circumstances. Her auburn hair was neatly braided, and her simple blue dress, though worn, was clean and carefully mended. What struck Sam most were her eyes, green as spring grass and filled with a quiet strength that reminded him of Mary's unwavering spirit. "That's the third one," announced Tom Bradley, the town's self-appointed voice of moral authority. "Theodore Walsh was supposed to marry her today, but he changed his mind, just like the others, when he found out she can't speak nor hear a blessed word." Sam watched as the woman's gaze moved across the faces surrounding her, reading their expressions with an intuition that spoke of years spent navigating a world that communicated without including her. She seemed to understand the nature of their discussion, though she couldn't hear their words. Her chin lifted slightly, not in defiance, but in the kind of resigned courage that comes from facing repeated disappointment. "Someone should write to her family back east," suggested another voice. "Tell them to come collect her." "Ain't got no family," Bradley replied with satisfaction. "She's a ward of the church now, and Father McKenna says he can't afford to keep. Feeding someone who can't earn her keep? I'd have to send her to that asylum in Denver." The word asylum seemed to land like a physical blow. Sam saw the woman's hands tremble slightly before she steadied them, her spine straightening with determination. She stood from the crate, smoothing her skirts, and began to walk away from the crowd with measured steps. Something in that moment, the way she held her head high, despite the whispers, the careful way she navigated around the people who stepped back as if her condition might be contagious, reminded Sam of a wild horse he'd once seen. Beautiful, proud, and completely alone, just trying to survive in a world that saw her as damaged goods. How much? The words left his mouth before he consciously decided to speak them. The crowd turned to stare at him in surprise. Sam Hartwell, the silent widower, had not only spoken but seemed to be asking about something that made no sense to them. "How much what, Sam?" Bradley asked, confused. "How much to take responsibility for her?" Sam's voice was rough from disuse, but his meaning was clear. He said the church can't keep her. "I've got a ranch that needs tending, and she looks capable of work." The woman had stopped walking and turned back at the sound of the commotion, though she couldn't hear the words being exchanged. Her eyes found Sam's across the distance, and something passed between them, not love, not even understanding, but a recognition of shared isolation. "You can't be serious," Mrs. Henderson protested. She's deaf and mute, Sam. How would you even communicate with her? Same way I communicate with everyone else, Sam replied, his gaze never leaving the woman's face. Barely at all? Father McKenna emerged from the church, drawn by the unusual activity. After a hurried conversation with Bradley, he approached Sam with the relieved expression of a man who had just been offered a solution to an impossible problem. If you're willing to provide for her and ensure she's treated with Christian kindness, the priest said carefully, the church would consider it a blessing. Marriage would be proper, of course. Sam nodded curtly. He understood the transaction and its implications. The woman would have shelter and security. He would have someone to help with the domestic tasks that had overwhelmed him since Mary's death. It wasn't love, neither of them was fool enough to expect that, but it was survival for both of them. As the crowd dispersed, chattering about the unexpected turn of events, Sam approached the woman slowly. She watched him with those intelligent green eyes, her expression guarded but not fearful. When he was close enough to see the fine lines around her eyes, evidence of squinting against sun and wind, he stopped and carefully removed his hat. He pointed to himself and said Samuel, knowing she couldn't hear, but hoping she might read his lips. Then he pointed to her and raised his eyebrows in question. She seemed to understand and pointed to herself, her lips forming the word Ruth, though no sound emerged. Ruth. It was a good name, Sam thought. Biblical and strong, like the woman who bore it. He gestured toward his horse and wagon, then back to her, asking without words if she would come with him. Ruth looked around the town one last time, at the faces that had never shown her genuine kindness, at the church that had sheltered her only reluctantly. When she turned back to Sam, her nod was firm and decisive. As they prepared to leave Copper Creek together, neither spoke, one because he had forgotten how, the other because she never could. But in that silence, something had begun that neither of them dared to name yet, the possibility that two broken people might, together, find a way to be whole. The ride back to Sam's ranch took 3 hours, traveling across rolling prairie land, marked by occasional stands of cottonwood and the distant silhouette of the Rocky Mountains. Ruth sat beside him on the wagon seat, her hands folded carefully in her lap, her eyes taking in the vastness of the landscape that would now be her home. Sam found himself glancing at her profile more often than necessary, noting how she observed everything with the intensity of someone who had learned to gather information through sight alone. The ranch house came into view as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, a modest 2-story structure of weathered wood and stone, surrounded by a barn, chicken coop, and various outbuildings that spoke of years of hard work and gradual expansion. Sam felt a flush of embarrassment as he saw it through her eyes, noting the broken fence rails he'd been meaning to mend. The garden plot that had gone to weeds since Mary's death, the general air of a place where a man lived alone without caring much for appearances. He helped Ruth down from the wagon. Their first physical contact, a brief, awkward moment when his hands circled her waist. She was lighter than he'd expected, and he caught a scent of lavender soap that reminded him, painfully, of how long it had been since a woman had graced this place. Ruth stepped back quickly, smoothing her skirts, and looked around the homestead with the practical eye of someone assessing her. New circumstances. Sam carried her single carpet bag, everything she owned in the world apparently, and led her to the front door. The interior of the house reflected the same neglect as the exterior, dust motes dancing in shafts of late sunlight. A stone fireplace, cold and empty, furniture covered with the thin layer of grime that accumulates when a man lives without thought for cleanliness. Ruth's eyes swept the main room, taking in the masculine chaos of newspapers stacked on tables, coffee cups left wherever they'd been set down, and the general disorder of someone who had stopped caring about domestic order. She set down her bag and, without asking permission, began to move through the space with purpose. Sam watched in fascination as she examined the kitchen pump, tested the handle to ensure it worked properly, opened cabinets to assess their contents. She found soap and a washing basin, filled it with water from the pump, and began cleaning the kitchen table with efficient movements. It wasn't criticism of his housekeeping, her expression remained neutral. but simply the actions of a woman establishing her place in a new environment. "You don't have to," Sam began, then stopped, remembering she couldn't hear him. Instead, he stood awkwardly in the doorway, uncertain how to navigate this new reality of sharing his space with someone who couldn't receive his words. Ruth glanced up at him and seemed to read something in his expression. She approached slowly and gestured to herself, then to the kitchen, then made a sweeping motion with her hands. The meaning was clear. This was something she could do, something useful she could contribute. Sam nodded his understanding, and something that might have been relief crossed her features. As evening approached, Sam showed Ruth to the small room that had served as Mary's sewing space. It contained a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the corral where his horses grazed. It wasn't much, but it was private and clean. Ruth examined the room with the same practical assessment she'd given the kitchen, then turned to him and pressed her palms together beside her cheek, a gesture that clearly meant sleep and gratitude. They ate their first meal together in complete silence. Ruth having prepared a simple but satisfying supper from the supplies Sam had brought from town. She had found his store of preserved vegetables and somehow transformed them into something that reminded him of the meals Mary used to make. The comparison brought a sharp pang of guilt, not because he was betraying Mary's memory, but because he realized how much he had forgotten about the simple pleasure of sharing a meal with another person after supper. Ruth insisted on cleaning the dishes while Sam tended to the horses. When he returned, he found her sitting at the kitchen table with a worn piece of paper and a pencil stub she had somehow procured. She had written something and pushed the paper toward him when he entered. "Thank you for your kindness," the note read in careful, educated script. "I will work hard to earn my place here. I know this arrangement serves both our needs, and I am grateful for the opportunity." Sam studied the note, struck by the formal tone and the assumption that this was purely a transaction. He took the pencil and wrote below her words, "You don't owe me anything. This is your home now." Ruth read his response, and for the first time since he'd met her, something that might have been a smile touched the corners of her mouth. She wrote again, "I can read lips if you speak slowly and face me. I have been deaf since childhood fever, but I am not simple-minded." Directness of this statement, addressing what Sam hadn't even known he was wondering about, impressed him. He had encountered deaf people before, in the war mostly, and had seen how others treated them as if they were mentally deficient rather than simply unable to hear. Ruth's note made it clear she was accustomed to correcting this assumption. "Never thought you were," he wrote back, and was rewarded with another almost smile. Over the following days, they developed a routine that worked around their mutual silence. Ruth proved to be exactly what Sam had claimed capable of work. She attacked the neglected house with systematic efficiency, cleaning and organizing with the satisfaction of someone who had been given purpose after too long without it. Sam found himself making small repairs he had been putting off for months. Motivated by her industry, and perhaps by a desire to show that he could maintain his property properly, they communicated through a combination of gestures, written notes, and the kind of intuitive understanding that develops between people who must rely on observation rather than words. Ruth proved remarkably adept at reading Sam's expressions and body language, often anticipating his needs before he recognized them himself. In return, Sam began to notice the subtle ways Ruth communicated her own thoughts, the tilt of her head when she was concentrating, the way her hands moved when she was thinking through a problem, the particular set of her shoulders. When she was determined about something, the physical aspects of their arrangement remained carefully undefined. They maintained separate sleeping quarters and observed the proprieties that would satisfy any neighbors who might inquire. But Sam began to notice small intimacies creeping into their daily interactions, Ruth mending a tear in his shirt without being asked, Sam bringing her wildflowers he'd found while checking the fence lines, the way they had learned to move around each other in the kitchen without collision or awkwardness. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Sam had finally started. Building regularly, Ruth showed him something she had been working on. She had found Mary's old embroidery supplies and had begun stitching a sampler with words, picked out in careful threads. "Home is where the heart finds peace." Sam stared at the sampler for a long time, thinking about the definition of home and whether it required love or simply the absence of loneliness. When he looked up, Ruth was watching him with those perceptive green eyes, and he realized she might be wondering the same thing. "It's beautiful," he said aloud, speaking slowly so she could read his lips. Ruth nodded and returned to her stitching, but Sam caught something in her expression that suggested his approval meant more to her than a simple compliment about needlework. That night, as Sam lay in his empty bed, listening to the sounds of another person moving around his house, water running, the soft footfalls of someone preparing for sleep, he realized that the suffocating silence of grief had been replaced by a different kind of quiet. This silence felt alive, populated by possibility and the gradual recognition that two people who had been cast aside by the world might, together, create something neither could achieve alone. He was not yet ready to call it love, but it was. No longer merely an arrangement of convenience, it was becoming something else entirely, though neither of them had the words spoken or written to name it yet. Winter arrived early that year, blanketing the ranch in snow that transformed the harsh prairie landscape into something almost beautiful. The isolation that came with the Montana winter suited both Sam and Ruth well. They had grown comfortable in their shared solitude, developing a rhythm of daily life that required fewer words and more intuitive understanding with each passing. Weak Ruth had proven herself invaluable during the autumn preparations. She had taken over the management of the household completely, preserving vegetables from the garden she had coaxed back to life, tending the chickens with gentle efficiency, and even helping Sam with some of the lighter ranch work when the weather permitted. Her silence, rather than being the burden others had assumed it would be, had become a source of peace for a man who had grown weary of meaningless conversation. One particularly harsh morning, Sam woke to find that the storm had knocked down a section of the barn roof. He spent the day in the bitter cold, struggling to make temporary repairs before more snow could damage the feed stores. When he finally came inside, exhausted and half-frozen, he found Ruth waiting with hot coffee and a warm meal, but also with something else, a look of concern that went beyond mere hospitality. She had prepared a hot bath for him in the kitchen, hanging blankets around the wash basin for privacy, and she gestured firmly toward it while pointing at his ice-crusted clothes. The intimacy of the Justera wife's care for her husband's well-being was not lost on either of them. But Ruth's expression brooked no argument. Sam was too cold and tired to protest this practical kindness. As he soaked in the warm water, Ruth sat at the kitchen table with her back carefully turned, working on her endless mending by lamplight. Sam found himself watching the way the light caught in her auburn hair, noting how her shoulders had lost some of their defensive tension over the months they had lived together. When had he stopped thinking of her as the deaf woman from town and started thinking of her simply as Ruth? "Ruth," he said quietly, testing whether she might sense his voice, even if she couldn't hear it. She turned immediately, as if she had some sixth sense for when she was being addressed. Her eyes found his across the kitchen, and something passed between them that had nothing to do with communication and everything to do with recognition. Later that evening, as they sat by the fire, Ruth pulled out the pad of paper they used for more complex communications. She wrote carefully and handed him the note. "You have been kind to me beyond what our arrangement required. I want you to know that I am grateful and that this feels more like home than any place I have ever lived." Sam read the note twice, touched by her formal way of expressing what felt like genuine affection. He took the pencil and wrote back, "You have made this house feel like a home again. I'd forgotten what that was like." Ruth read his response and looked up at him with an expression he couldn't quite interpret. She wrote again, "Do you miss your wife very much?" The question surprised him with its directness. Sam considered how to answer honestly without being cruel to the woman sitting across from him. "Every day," he wrote. "But the pain has changed. It used to feel like drowning. Now it feels like remembering something beautiful that taught me how to recognize kindness when I see it again." Ruth studied his words for a long time before writing her response. "I have never been married. I used to think it was because of my deafness, but now I wonder if it was because I was waiting for someone who could hear me without words." The honesty of this statement took Sam's breath away. He looked at Ruth really, looked at her hand. saw not the desperate woman he had rescued from an impossible situation, but someone who had been waiting for the same thing he had been denying he needed. A partner who understood that the deepest communications happen in silence. Over the following weeks, something shifted between them.
Oh.
They began to sit closer together. By the fire in the evenings, Ruth would sometimes rest her hand on Sam's arm when she wanted his attention, and he found excuses to touch her shoulder when passing behind her chair. These small physical contacts carried a weight of meaning that neither of them was quite ready to acknowledge openly. One snowy afternoon, while Sam was repairing a bridle in the main room, Ruth approached him with a determined expression. She gestured to herself, then to the bridle, then made motions suggesting she could help. Sam smiled and showed her how to hold the leather while he worked the needle through the tough material. Working together in close proximity, Sam became acutely aware of Ruth's presence, the concentration on her face as she learned the task, the way she anticipated his movements, the warmth of her hands when they accidentally brushed against his. When the repair was finished, Ruth didn't immediately move away. Instead, she stayed close, looking up at him with an expression that seemed to be asking a question she didn't know how to write. Sam reached up slowly and touched her face, tracing the line of her cheek with his thumb. Ruth's eyes fluttered closed. At the contact, and when she opened them again, he saw something there that made his heart race with possibilities he had thought were buried with Mary. "Ruth," he said aloud, speaking her name like a prayer. She seemed to feel the vibration of his voice, because her hand came up to rest against his throat, feeling the movement of his vocal cords as he repeated her name. For a moment they stayed, frozen in this tableau, his hand on her face, hers against his throat, both of them breathing carefully as if sudden movement might break whatever spell had settled over them. Then Ruth smiled, and it was not the cautious, almost smile he had grown accustomed to, but something radiant and unguarded that transformed her entire face. That night, Ruth knocked softly on Sam's bedroom door. When he opened it, she handed him a note. "I know this was not what either of us expected when we made our arrangement, but I want you to know that what I feel for you is real, even if I cannot speak it aloud." Sam read the note and then looked at Ruth, standing in the doorway. In her nightgown and wrapper, her hair loose around her shoulders, she looked vulnerable and brave and beautiful. And Sam realized that somewhere in the careful dance of their daily lives, he had fallen in love with her not as a replacement for Mary, but as herself, with her quiet strength and generous spirit, and the way she had taught him that communication was about far more than words. "What I feel for you is real too," he said slowly, so she could read his lips. "I'm not, and I don't need to hear your voice to know that you love me back." Ruth's face crumpled with relief and joy, and she stepped into his arms as naturally as if she had always belonged there. As Sam held her, feeling her tears against his shoulder, he realized that love didn't always announce itself with grand declarations or perfect timing. Sometimes it grew quietly in the spaces between words, nurtured by kindness and mutual respect. In the simple recognition that two imperfect people could create something whole. Together, they stood together in the doorway for a long time, holding each other in the lamplight, finally ready to acknowledge what had been building between them all along, a love that didn't need words to be heard, understood, or returned. Spring came late to Montana that year, but when it finally arrived, it brought with it a sense of renewal that seemed to mirror the transformation taking place within the walls of Sam Hartwell's ranch house. The snow melted to reveal a landscape ready for new growth, and Ruth threw herself into the work of preparing the expanded garden she had planned during the long winter months. Sam watched her from the corral one morning, noting how she moved. With a confidence and sense of belonging that had been entirely absent when she first arrived, Ruth had gained weight over the winter, losing the gaunt desperation that had marked her features in town. Her auburn hair caught the morning light as she bent over the seedbed, and Sam felt a familiar warmth spread through his chest, the recognition that this woman had become essential to his happiness in ways he was still discovering. Their relationship had deepened over the winter months, though they had maintained the proprieties that their unusual arrangement required. They slept in separate rooms, but their days were filled with the kind of intimate partnership that many married couples never achieved. Ruth had learned to read Sam's moods and needs with an accuracy that sometimes startled him, while he had developed an appreciation for the subtle ways she communicated her own thoughts and feelings. The physical affection between them had grown naturally, progressing from accidental touches to deliberate ones. Ruth's hand on Sam's shoulder when she passed behind his chair, his fingers briefly tangling with hers when she handed him his coffee. Moments of closeness by the fire that lasted longer than strictly necessary. But they had not yet crossed the final boundary that would transform their arrangement. From one of convenience into something that could honestly be called a marriage, that changed on a warm afternoon in early May, when Father McKenna arrived. Unexpectedly at the ranch, Sam saw the priest's buggy approaching and felt a familiar tension settle in his shoulders. Official visits usually meant problems, and he had grown protective of the peaceful life he and Ruth had built together. Ruth, who had been hanging laundry on the line behind the house, appeared at his side as they watched the priest climb down from his conveyance. "Mr. Hartwell," Father McKenna called out, approaching with the slightly cautious manner of a man who wasn't entirely sure of his welcome. "I hope I'm not intruding. I wanted to check on how you and Ruth were managing." Sam noticed how the priest's eyes moved between him and Ruth, taking in her improved appearance and the obvious signs that the household was thriving under her care. "We're managing fine, Father," Sam replied carefully. "I'm glad to hear it," McKenna said, though his tone suggested he had more on his mind than a simple welfare check. "The truth is, there's been some talk in town about your living arrangements. Nothing malicious, you understand. People do wonder about the propriety of an unmarried man and woman sharing a household." Ruth had been reading the priest's lips, and Sam saw her stiffen at the implication. The old defensiveness, he remembered, from their first meeting began to creep back into her posture. And Sam felt a surge of protective anger at the thought that she might once again be subjected to the judgment of people who had never tried to understand her. "What exactly are you suggesting, Father?" Sam asked, his voice carrying a warning edge. McKenna raised his hands placatingly. "Nothing inappropriate, I assure you. It's just that if you were to make your arrangement ... official ... it would satisfy the concerns of those who care about such things, and might provide Ruth with the security of knowing her place here is permanent." Sam glanced at Ruth, who was watching the conversation with growing tension. She couldn't hear the words, but she could read the body language of both men well enough to understand that her future was being discussed. The vulnerability in her expression reminded Sam of how she had looked that first day in town, waiting to be rejected once again by circumstances beyond her control. "Give us a moment," Sam said to the priest, then turned to face Ruth directly. Speaking slowly so she could read his lips, he said, "He's suggesting we get married properly. Make our arrangement official." Ruth's eyes widened, and Sam could see her working through the implications. She gestured to herself questioningly, then to him, her expression asking whether this was something he wanted or simply something he felt obligated to do. Sam took her hands in his, feeling the calluses she had developed from months of hard work. Alongside him, "Ruth," he said carefully, "I'm not asking because of what other people think. I'm asking because I love you, and I want you to know that your place here is permanent no matter what anyone else says." The transformation of Ruth's expression from uncertainty to joy was like watching the sun break through storm clouds. She nodded enthusiastically, then threw her arms around Sam's neck with a spontaneity that made him laugh out loud. The first genuine laughter Father McKenna had ever heard from the taciturn rancher. "I take it that's a yes?" the priest asked with a smile. "That's a yes," Sam confirmed, holding Ruth close and feeling her laughter vibrate through her chest even though he couldn't hear it. They were married the following Sunday in the small church in Copper Creek, with the entire town in attendance, more out of curiosity than celebration. Ruth wore a simple yellow dress she had sewn herself, and Sam had managed to procure a new shirt and tie for the occasion. The ceremony was brief, conducted in words that Ruth could not hear but could feel in the way. Sam held her hand, and the way he looked at her when he spoke his vows. When Father McKenna pronounced them husband and wife, Sam kissed Ruth with a tenderness that surprised the watching congregation. This was not the desperate transaction they had expected, but something that looked remarkably like genuine love. The wedding supper was a quiet affair back at the ranch. Just the two of them sharing a meal that Ruth had prepared with special, care. As the sun set over the Montana landscape, they sat together on the porch Sam had been meaning to build for years, and had finally completed as a wedding gift for his new wife. "Are you happy?" Sam asked, signing the question in the basic gesture language they had developed together over the months. Ruth's response was to lean against him, resting her head on his shoulder with a contentment that needed no translation. They sat in comfortable silence as the stars appeared overhead, each lost in their own thoughts about the unlikely journey that had brought them to this moment. Later that night, as they crossed the threshold of Sam's bedroom together for the first time as a truly married couple, Ruth stopped and took out the small notebook she always carried. She wrote something and handed it to Sam. "Thank you for hearing me when no one else would listen." The note read, "Thank you for teaching me that love doesn't need words to be real." Sam read the note and then pulled Ruth into his arms, holding her close as he whispered into her hair. Words of love she couldn't hear, but could feel in every fiber of her being. As they came together in the lamplight, two people who had been discarded by the world discovered that the most profound communications happen not through speech, but through the language of touch, trust, and the recognition that true partnership transcends any limitation. In the years that followed, Sam and Ruth Hartwell became known throughout the territory as a couple whose love story challenged every assumption about what was required for a successful marriage. They raised children who grew up bilingual and spoke in English and the sign language their parents had developed together. They built a prosperous ranch through the kind of wordless cooperation that can only exist between people who truly understand each other. And sometimes, on quiet evenings, when the Montana wind whispered across the prairie, neighbors claimed they could hear laughter from the Hartwell Ranch, the sound of two people who had learned that the most. Beautiful conversations happen in silence, and that love, when it is real, speaks in a language that everyone can understand, but few have the courage to learn. Their story became legend in Copper Creek, not because it was dramatic or unusual, because it proved something the townspeople had never quite believed, that sometimes the most broken people, when they find each other, can create something more beautiful and whole than either could have imagined alone.